Hey, welcome to another Garden America podcast. Love having you aboard here, Facebook Live, and of course, later on as we upload to our podcast site, iHeartMedia. You can also listen to it, but again, watching it live. And of course, our YouTube page, Garden America Radio. All of our shows and podcasts are uploaded there as well. So plenty of places to rewatch or rehear these podcasts. Today, we're going to be talking about propagating succulents, Tiger and John. And I know succulents have become rather popular the past several years. But a lot of information still needs to be given because I think to a lot of people, they hear cactus, they hear succulents, they think desert, they think they don't need water. So let's talk about that, Tiger, from the beginning and how to take care of succulents.
So, the first thing I want to mention is that out there in the industry, in the garden world, there's always the people that say, oh, yeah, this is super easy. You just do this and it grows.
Sure.
And not to say that that won't happen, but there's a right way and a wrong way. And it's not that the wrong way you'll fail. It's just that the right way makes you more successful down the road. When we're talking about propagating succulents, and this is what you should do to follow the best practices, so that way when you take 10 succulents, you're going to have 9 of them actually root and grow. Where if you do it the wrong way, you might have, say, 5. It all depends because there has to be other things that line up for you in order for them to grow. I mean, one of the biggest things that, people say when, propagating succulents is allow it to heal. Allow that cutting, allow that stem to kind of callus over before you plant it again. So that way you can ensure that the roots are going to come out. It's not going to just rot out. Well, there's also those people that will just say, oh, no, you just take a clipping, you drop it in the dirt and it grows. And,
well, yeah, that may be the case, but you're saying long-term success, don't do it that way.
Well, I'm just saying that you're not going to have as much success as you might hope, kind of a thing. So what we're going to try to do is give everyone the best practice. And you know what? Some people might take it and do what they can, and other people might, modify it a little bit. But it's not necessarily that they're going to fail. It's just that we're going to give you the way that you do it to be able to be most successful. Do
cactus and succulents, are they, to a lot of people, they've probably never even grown one from the very get-go. You buy them when they're small in pots, or you see them bigger.
Yeah.
So what does it look like? Is it a seed?
Yeah. So, a lot of succulent growers do start those little plants from seed.
Okay.
Sometimes, they do propagate them depending on the variety, if they're easier to propagate or start from seed. But it all depends on you and how you want to grow it. I don't think the average homeowner grows them from seed very often. It's mostly from a cutting or from some kind of a clipping, that you do end up propagating a succulent from. Where growers will grow them from seed pretty common, unless the grower has a variety, and that's the way you propagate varieties is from tissue culture or from a cutting to ensure that you get the same plant time and time again.
I'm going to bet that John has never propagated a succulent.
Nah.
Ever in his life.
I just gave away a bunch. When I think it was Father's Day last year that my son and his girlfriend gave me a succulent planter that had a jade plant and some type of euphorbia in the center that grew way too fast, and then some echeverias and sedums around the side. And when we had our house tented before we moved, this was on the back patio, and I came back, 3 days later, and the plant in the middle had completely died, and all the leaves had fallen off, most of the succulents. So
epic fail.
Yeah, so most people would just throw it away, right?
Right, sure.
But I brought it with me when we moved, and the jade plant came back right away. And then the other succulents started to grow, but they had these long stems that were maybe 8 inches long with just a few little leaves at the end. So what I did was I cut off the ends of each of the each of the echeveria, and the same thing with the sedums, and let them callus over. I think I waited a couple days. And the reason you want to let them callus over is so that there is a barrier that forms between the end of the succulent and the soil it's going to be put in. Because if that doesn't happen, it's very easy for root rots to get in.
Right.
It'll just rot the stem. So anyway, I let those callus over and then cut everything else that was in the bowl back down to ground level. And then I just took these cuttings, stuck them in, and this weekend yesterday actually, when Jesse and Melanie came over, the bowl was completely full. And Jesse goes, "Wow, that looks better than the day we gave it to you." And not only that, I had all kinds of pots left over from when I moved, all kinds of little decorative pots.
Sure.
You buy a plant and something dies. Well, I had filled those with cuttings too. And I said I even took extras because I didn't want to throw away the cuttings I had, and started these little pots. And I had no idea what I was going to do with them, but Melanie really liked them. And I said, "Here, you want them? You want one? You can have it." And she goes, "Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah." I said, "You want two? want all three?" So she took all three.
But they didn't have any idea of the condition that it was in before you moved to bring it back?
No.
So
no,
they just the last they saw was the day they gave it to you.
Right. Yeah, it looked really good.
And it went through all this, and you brought it back is what you did.
Right. So there are a lot of succulents that can be started from stem cuttings like that, but most of those type of succulents, echeverias and sedums, can also be started from leaf cuttings. And it's the same thing. You pull off one leaf and let it sit for a day or two to callus over. And then you don't even have to bury it. You almost just let it lie on the soil with the end of the leaf, touching soil.
Right.
And that'll root, and you'll start a new plant just from leaves. So a sedum, some of those things like pork and beans that have, hundreds of leaves, you could take, maybe a dozen of them, throw them in a pot, and within a couple months, that whole pot would be full of new plants.
And, the neat thing about that is like, you can take, I tell people to take one of those trays that ground covers come in, not the nursery tray. It's a square black plastic, not the nursery one, because they have holes in the bottom that, where they hold color packs together because you can't hold soil in it. But the ones with the ground cover,
the flats, ground
cover flat is designed where it holds soil. You fill that with a nice potting soil or a cactus mix. And then you take a series of succulents, and you can do some pork and beans, you can do some burrowtail, you can do some echeverias in one flat, so you have it all confined and ready to go.
Right.
You start them all there, and then you can take those plants out individually and put them in different pots or group them together. But it's really easy to do it that way because you have it all in one spot, where when you try to start them in multiple pots, it can sometimes be a little challenging to be able to keep them all at the same water or anything like that. So, if you have access to those ground cover flats, always have 2 or 3 of those on hand, and you can always be propagating new plants because for the most part, you can almost do it year round. I mean, there's things that you can...
it doesn't work really well in cold, wet conditions, but as long as it's dry and not too cold, you can pretty much do it
California,
year-round.
Arizona, Texas, Florida. Obviously
and
those
even
states,
then,
New Mexico.
if you keep that starting tray in a covered patio or something like that during those times of year, you can still do it, And so it's pretty neat to always have the ability. And when we talk about some of these Pinterest items, these pumpkins, different little things, Deborah Lee Baldwin does with her succulent arrangements. The only way that they can do those, economically, is to have those cuttings. Because if you go to the nursery, you're buying each one of those for $2.
Well, online, Kathy just mentions that she's having a succulent wedding next year. They're planning
Kathy
one,
with a K.
and and they're starting propagation now.
Yeah. Because you can start hundreds of plants for a bag of potting soil, kind of a thing.
You mentioned the potting soil. It's important to use cactus mix because it's well drained. If you're going to use regular potting soil, I would recommend putting in 50% perlite.
Yeah.
So half soil and half perlite.
And you need good drainage, obviously.
It has to drain, otherwise it's going to rot.
Yeah, you're going to get a lot of too much water on a succulent. It's just the root's just going to rot right out.
I had some species echeverias at home that someone at work had given me, and I had them at my old house. They were in 4-inch pots, and I really wasn't sure what I was going to do with them. I wasn't sure at that time if we were going to move or not. So I left them in the pots, and I moved them from one part of the yard to another. They got thrown in different areas, neglected, not watered. None of them died, but I had echeverias with a little growth at the tip and 1 foot to a foot and a half long stems, kind of curling and snaking around. So a couple months ago, I cut the tops off every one and stuck them in 1 gallon containers.
How much did you leave on the stem?
Maybe an inch.
Okay.
Just an inch or two. So it looks like they were grown that way on purpose. So they look really nice. And I used a mixture of soil and, those rocks I had shown
Yeah,
you.
yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, the rocks that are really light.
Yeah, and I was trying to think of the name of those right now. But I was shocked at how quickly they rooted. I would say within 2 weeks, they were rooted solid into that container.
Mm.
And I kept the stems of the ones that I had cut and left them in their original pots. And I'm just now beginning to see a tiny bit of growth, on the sides of the stems.
The sides will come out little buds.
Yeah.
Coming out from the sides. That's really neat.
Is that something that people do with succulents? We talk about, getting cuttings and propagating roses and so on and so forth. How popular is doing the same thing, what we're talking about with succulents?
I think it's probably the most popular plant to do this because it's the easiest.
It's simple.
Right?
The simplicity of it.
Exactly. I mean, this is a little bit different, but I've got this agave plant that probably flowered at one point in time and now has all these pups shooting out from it. So I'll go in there and I'll dig them out because I don't want 1,000 pups around this one agave. But I mean, I can take those pups, cut it with my spade, dig it out, have a little one about 4 to 5 inches across, right? I'll just put them in a bucket because I'll do this over the weekend. Then I'll throw them in the back of my truck, taking them to work on Monday. One of the people there will can them whenever they have a chance. They could be sitting out of soil for a week or two.
Yeah, exactly.
And probably even longer. But all you do is drop that little pup into a can, 1 gallon can with some potting soil.
And it's going to root.
And it roots and takes off. There's not a lot of plants that you can do that with.
Well, you bring up a good point about cactus and succulents. If you were just to take one and throw it on the ground, it's going to be fine for probably a few weeks.
Yeah.
Seriously. So unlike a lot of other plants that need soil, need rooting, need water, all that.
Yeah.
Of course, these do too, but they're pretty
you have
hardy.
much more leeway.
Yeah, there's more leeway here. For a beginner, I think it'd be a great idea for a beginner to start this way, and then once you learn how to propagate that, then move on to something else if that becomes your hobby.
Yeah, and so when it comes to the succulents, you got your senecio, your crassula, you got your portulacarias, your echeverias, your aeoniums. Those are the common ones that you see at a garden center. And, what John mentioned, you cut the top off of it, leave an inch or so of stem, let it heal, 3 days to a week kind of a thing, and then put either that leaf or that cutting into a real well porous soil, water it once, and then maybe, if it's a well-draining soil, you maybe water once every 10 days to 2 weeks. What do you think?
Yeah, it depends on the heat. Once a week.
Yeah.
Once every 2 weeks.
And some people will say rooting hormone and different things like that. What are your thoughts on some of those?
Rooting hormone won't hurt.
Right.
But everything that we're talking about that I just started, it's no hormones.
No, and no fertilizer either.
Right.
Yeah. So people will talk about rooting hormone or fertilizers. And again, back to this idea.
I just thought of this. I don't mean to interrupt you, but one thing that does work is if you dip them in cinnamon rather than a rooting hormone, then they don't rot.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
The cinnamon protects it, huh?
Yep.
Yeah. How about that? And cinnamon also kills ants. 2 things right there that it does.
You won't have ants. And if you lick your succulents, you get a nice taste.
That'd be a great T-shirt. Be sure to lick your succulent. Have you licked your succulent today?
So, in the beginning of the show, we talked about kind of like this proper way to do things. And some people will say, rooting hormones or the cinnamon. And again, you're just ensuring your success when you use these products. They're not hurting. They're just going to kind of make that one, kind of like that idea. Okay, you let it heal. Why? So that way it doesn't rot. Okay. Now, can you plant it without it healing? Yes, but you risk rotting. Rooting hormone. Why would you not want to use rooting hormone versus why would you want to? Well, if, for instance, you're trying to propagate succulents in a rarely damp region
Sure.
of the world, you might have less success because they're constantly rotting out. Well, rooting hormone will encourage rooting much quicker, and it'll protect from fungal problems also, which could cause your problems. So, us in Southern California, it's easy for us to root succulents because we have a dry environment. But if you're trying to root succulents in Portland, and there's nothing you can do to keep it dry because you just have a humid
Sure.
environment, that's where you might want to take the steps
Or the bayous of Louisiana.
Yeah.
That would be a huge challenge right there.
Yeah, that's where you might want to use a rooting hormone because in rooting hormone, it has nutrients to be able to help encourage root development, but it also has fungicides in it to prevent like rot. Most rooting hormones, that's part of their protection is to prevent the cutting from rotting as well.
Some varieties of plants are more difficult to root than others, too. The ones we've been talking about are really simple to root, but some are a little more difficult, and the ones that are a little more difficult or take longer, a rooting hormone would really help.
Would help, yeah.
And then, so even if you had good conditions, you would recommend a rooting hormone just because?
Yeah, again, it doesn't hurt.
Right.
It doesn't hurt, Fertilizers, though, I would be careful with propagating.
I don't think I've ever fertilized a succulent.
Well,
I have to admit the echeverias that I was talking about, I put in Osmocote.
Okay.
And the reason I did
just a
was,
granular, or
okay.
I still have some of that left.
Is because I wasn't going to fertilize them, and I knew it would be there when they needed it, and I didn't want to have to think about fertilizing later on.
You feel better admitting that now? If you got that off your chest?
Well, they're doing really well. It's just a time-release fertilizer, I think, is a good way to go with plants in a pot. Another way of propagating succulents, you had mentioned the agaves that were pupping at the bottom, and aloes do that too. You can also, some of those, when they bloom, have arils along the flowering stem of the plant where little plantlets form, and you can take those little ones and start them from there.
Yeah, and it's amazing to see those developing along that flower. They're literally little agave or little aloe plants that you see, and you just pluck them off and then put those in your little rooting tray or whatever, and they'll grow from there. Now, there is a plant out there called Mother of Millions, or Mother of Thousands, which will
it's like kalanchoe,
which will send up these flower spikes, and all it is, it looks like leaves are falling off of it, but that's actually how it propagates, and it just falls down, and then next thing you know, the reason why it's called Mother of Thousands or Millions is because it just keeps
going,
growing from that.
Yeah, they're invasive.
And it's similar to that, but obviously those plants are very aggressive, where an agave or aloe are usually not as aggressive when it comes to being able to pup out like that. When you see those spikes emerge, and specifically for aloes, because they're much more manageable, agave spikes will sometimes be 25 feet tall, when they flower, and that's why they call it the century plant. Is because
I had one in Pacific
supposed
Beach.
to bloom once every 100 years, and then all these plants come up from it. But
they do get huge.
Yeah,
it's a huge
the aloes are usually at a manageable height that you can work with. Do you have to wait till the full stem has flowered and you start to see those develop, or can you kind of pluck them off at any time when you see them develop? I just kind of see them when they're spent flowering usually, and then I start to see those plants.
I'm trying to think. I don't know if I've ever seen plantlets on an aloe.
No,
I think just on an agave.
Maybe I'm thinking different than because you know how sometimes like that
aloes put out red flowering spikes
arborescence
usually.
though, and then they'll put out the flower, and then don't you sometimes see like little ones coming out from that area as well, or no? Am I wrong? Because you know how they're all at the head, like
Well, aloes usually pup a lot.
So,
and a lot of times when they're flowering, they're also pupping.
Okay, so maybe that's where.
Yeah. So.
Okay.
But
so just the agaves
but
are the
agaves
one.
die when they flower.
Right, and so
that's when the plantlets form.
And then as soon as because they start at the base and kind of go towards the tip, that the ones at the base you can start kind of plucking off as soon as you see them kind of developing if you wanted to propagate those?
Yeah, you can usually see a few leaves. If you don't, like almost like with the kalanchoe that you were talking about, they'll drop to the ground and you can pick them up there.
Yeah.
I had a related to the same type of growth. I had a Fucrea McDougallii, which is native to Baja, and that puts out, when it blooms, probably a 20 to 30 foot flower spike, which is on top of a plant that's already 15 to 20 feet tall. And the flowers to me look like little Cymbidium orchids. But then it starts dropping those little plantlets everywhere, and you pick them up by the bushel and you can start new plants.
Just in the tray like we talked about. Yeah. Easy way to do it, right?
I had one that bloomed. They take about 20 years to bloom. And I had one that bloomed, and then I had it's kind of a rare plant too. I think it's endangered in Baja, if I'm not mistaken. And it's really a neat specimen when you see them growing. But I picked all those up and I gave them to a grower who ended up putting them in 15-gallon cans and ended up selling 1,000 plants at $30 wholesale. So it was $30,000 just from the
one plant.
Well, from the one plant that I had given him.
Wow. And the one thing that I'll say about succulents too and propagating them is that if you find that good balance of care, because you can overtake care, you can overwater them, you can overfertilize them. It's gonna have a negative effect on the plant by doing it. But you can also find that balance of good care, and they grow quickly. So you can propagate plants. And who was it that was mentioning the wedding?
Kathy
had mentioned the wedding. Start propagating now for next year.
Yeah.
She can easily have some, a ton of succulents.
Sure, more than she needs.
More than she needs. And, starting it 12 months in advance. I mean, some of this stuff you can wait 6 months and have ton. As long as you take good care of it and grow it out, they grow quickly. A lot of the succulents that don't grow quickly, it's because they're not getting the ideal care. They also manage themselves. So you can water that one plant once every 8 months. It's still going to live. It's still going to grow, but it's not going to grow large. It's not going to grow quickly. It's not going to
be optimum.
But if you watered it once every 2 weeks, gave it a fertilizer every couple months, then it can grow large and do wonderful things. So that's I think another reason why people do enjoy propagating succulents is because they see results much quicker than they see, John's talked about having his rose propagation, and he'll take a cutting from a rose and grow it out. It cannot be a bush for years. It's going to take a couple years for it to turn into a rose bush.
Whereas a succulent, you're going to see quicker success.
Within 6 months, you have a bush kind of a thing. You have
Any last minute thoughts on propagating succulents as we wrap up this podcast?
Well, Rick had a question. He was wondering if there's succulents that can take the cold. And I would recommend you can go to Amazon and
he's going to need this advice.
Buying a book called Hardy Succulents. And there are succulents in cactus that do take the cold. Just depends.
A lot of cactus.
So what's the book called again, John? Hardy Succulents?
Hardy Succulents, yeah. There was, I think I've mentioned this on air before, but when I was going to Michigan State University in East Lansing, gets really cold up there, temperatures to 15 below zero sometimes, and snow and everything. There were actually some cactus that could live through that.
Thanks to the book Hardy Succulents. So, Rick, that would be some good advice.
Those woolly-looking cactus, and they can tolerate some snow even. It's pretty amazing.
Wow.
Oh, I didn't know that. I thought they were really tender.
No.
Huh.
Yeah.
Well, Rick, that's a good question. Again, the book is Hardy Succulents for anybody who lives in an area that you may not deem ideal for growing succulents.
Don't overwater. That's my only
suggestion. Yeah, don't overwater. So that's going to do it. Thank you so much for your questions, your comments on this podcast called Propagating Succulents. We will upload that to our iHeartMedia platform early next week. So, again, a chance to watch it again right here on our Facebook page. You can go to our YouTube channel and watch it again. Listen to it via the podcast. And, of course, John puts a link in our newsletter every week if you get the newsletter. One more reason to get the newsletter. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your questions. Enjoy the rest of your Labor Day weekend if you got the time off. For John Bagnasco, Tiger Palafox, I'm Brian Main. Have a great week. Be safe, and thank you for tuning in to this edition, I should say, of our Garden America podcast, Propagating Succulents. Take care.